and multiple Brians in some of my classes. Okay, you're on.
As I said, Brian Conrad. Here to argue the idea that the American population, past or present, suffers greatly from xenophobia. For those of you who don't know, unfamiliar with the term xenophobia, it describes an intense fear or dislike of foreign peoples, their cultures, ideas, and customs. Our xenophobic behavior can be noted in three significant areas of action. First being agencies and programs we've established in the past. Many of them are founded on highly racist intentions. Two are wars that we've participated in. Many have been fought solely over the purpose of differences in cultures and people. And third, legislation. We've passed many laws in the past that have hindered certain races from having rights that we're all accustomed to. Okay, so my first point, agencies and programs. The establishment of many agencies within the U.S. have been founded on highly racist intentions. Most notable is the KKK. I mean, we all know the Ku Klux Klan. What we might not know, in fact, is they started it back in the 1860s. After the Civil War, blacks got freedom. They weren't really happy with that. I mean, their whole motto is the furtherment of white supremacy. So they were against blacks. They came back in 1915, around the time when we had a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe. They weren't democracies such as Western Europe, like France and Britain, so they didn't like the idea of that, and so they came back around then. And then lastly, their third wave is now. So I mean, we all know what they're like now. Another example is McCarthyism. And Ted Morgan, the author of Red's McCarthyism in America, describes McCarthyism as a trend of paranoia during the 40s and 50s, characterized by heightened fears of communist influence on America. Now again, what I said, xenophobia is an intense fear. So back in the 50s, you have Senator Joseph McCarthy. He had this extensive list of celebrities and people and politicians that he accused of being communistic, and we put propaganda out about communist people being evil, and there's the whole Red Scare. I mean, communism really it's just it's an idea of politics and economy. It's a sharing of wealth. So I mean, really, we're putting hatred on there for no reason back in the 50s. And then lastly, you have like the American Nazi Party, still prevalent today. I mean, it's not very popular, but they have their own website and everything. They took their ideas from Hitler. They denied the Holocaust, but they do have hatred against blacks, communists, and Jews. Most notable was the Skokie trial. It was actually a Supreme Court trial where they wanted to rally in Skokie, Illinois, by Chicago. It was a whole Jewish community, like 90% of it was Jewish. The Supreme Court upheld the First Amendment that they had the right to rally there, but they got them to compromise, and it was actually in Chicago. They actually had held it in Chicago. Secondly, we have wars. America has participated in wars that have been fought solely over the differences between cultures and ideals and others. You have the Civil War. I mean, that was a war, we fought our own selves, the South and the North. It was specifically over the fact that the South thought that black people were inferior to us and that they should, do our work, be our slaves. I mean, that's pretty, injustice. You also have the Korean and Vietnam Wars. That's during the Cold War era. You may know what the Vietnam War is, maybe not the Korean War. Pretty much very similar. We aided the South to fight North Korea to repel the spreading of communism in the East Hemisphere. We saw that Chinese communists were spreading their regime, and we pretty much just sent troops into Korea and Vietnam to suppress their efforts. Again, communism is not a bad thing. It's a political ideal, and again, we took our affairs and put it over there. I mean, they were civil wars, and we created proxy wars by taking our affairs and putting it into theirs. And lastly, you have the insurrection in Iraq right now. I mean, there's been many motives behind it. People have said it's the WMDs and all that. But the fact of the matter is that the proposal of troop withdrawal did not come until after the establishment of the Provincial Reconstruction Teams, which is in 2006. It's known as the PRTs. What the PRTs were, according to the U.S. Agency for International Development, were their whole idea was to build provincial capacity, foster economic development, and strengthen law within Iraq. To me, that just sounds like we're trying to create a democracy over there. And okay, so if we're now proposing the withdrawal of troops after that establishment. It's like kind of like, okay, were we over there to create our own democracy or what? Lastly, legislation. America's history has been painted with numerous amounts of laws focused on prohibiting rights of any kind to individuals of different races. Notable is the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. According to the United States statutes at large, it explains that it's an immigration quota that limited the number of immigrants who could be admitted from any country to 3% of the number of persons from that country already living in the United States in 1910. They further restricted that 3 years later with the Immigration Act of 1924 to 2%. So again, they were Eastern European people. We only hammered them because we didn't like that they weren't democratic nations, kind of like France and Britain and Ireland. There was also the Jim Crow laws. Those were the separate but equal laws that we put against African Americans after the Civil War. They didn't even have the right to vote until 1965. We also had slavery legislation against them, like the 3/5 Compromise, saying that they counted as 3/5 of a person in elections. And lastly, Immigration Reform Control Act of 1986, recent. It's the Mexican immigration deal. It said anyone who isn't a U.S. citizen or legal resident cannot legally hold a job. So we're hampering certain peoples from getting in and trying to live the American dream. So in conclusion, I argue that the general American population suffers from xenophobia, which is intense fear of foreign people due to the agencies we've created, wars we've participated in, and the laws we have passed.
All right, you identify the claim pretty clearly and what the secondary points are going to be. I think that you signpost them as you get to them. On your first point, your examples are the KKK, McCarthyism, and the Nazi Party. How that's indicative of the American character and therefore indicative of our xenophobia is not quite clear. If you had some data about how widespread membership in the KKK was, or how McCarthyism was largely supported by the population, or that 1 out of 3 people in the U.S. is a Nazi, then I could see that there is some relevance here. But otherwise, it seems like it's a huge inferential leap from a very narrow example, and it's not a typical example. I think your better examples are the ones that come at the end, where you're talking about the Quota Act of 1921 and Jim Crow laws and the constitutional provision that defined slaves as 3/5 of a person. I think those might be more indicative and would fit better on your first point. Lose the examples that you have there and then develop those particular points, because they actually have some relevance to the point that you're talking about. On the point about the wars that you're talking about, I just think that this is a little bit problematic, because when you argue that communism's not a bad thing, and therefore we're just fighting against a political ideology. At one point you're saying, communism's not a bad thing, but apparently democracy in Iraq is a bad thing. That's just a weird contrast of points of view that I don't understand how it's illustrative of xenophobia, either one of those kinds of things. If we are, how is it xenophobic if we're fighting with South Vietnamese against North Vietnamese, unless, of course, we think that the South Vietnamese, they're the good kind of strange people, and the North Vietnamese, they're the bad kind of strange people. That one doesn't fit your point on this particular issue, so I think that's a little bit problematic. I think you're just making some big inferences from some examples that don't fit those particular points. And the one place that you do have, I think, some good examples that might illustrate the xenophobia, that comes right at the end, and it's a little bit underdeveloped. All right, thank you very much.